Andrea, are we good to go? Yeah? Fantastic, thank you. Jeremy.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Duncan Wood, the Mexico Institute, and the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center. It's always a pleasure to come to Washington, and especially at the invitation of the prestigious Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you so much, and always good friends. Deputy Secretary, congratulations. Just a comment at the very beginning, since this is a North American energy forum, and I want to echo something that Sarah Ladislaw said at the beginning. You sort of go back to the last 10 or 15 years, really 20 years, say right around the NAFTA implementation time, and you think about how much has changed. And you just take one simple pronouncement at the North American Leaders Summit of this commitment of 50% clean energy by 2050. We can debate whether it's going to be met, how it's going to be met, how do you make up this 5% gap, whatever the details are. I just want to take that one little granular detail to emphasize how far our region, North America, these three countries have come when it comes to trilateral cooperation. Everyone in this room and around this table, not that long ago, sat at discussions that were effectively 3 bilateral sessions. They weren't trilateral. They were bilateral sessions that Mexico would talk to U.S. and Canada would talk to U.S. and vice versa. You know, the point is that there is an immense amount of cooperation, and I think a large part of that has to be granted to the Mexican energy reform, because all of a sudden these things that Sarah commented also about, where well, we had this roundtable, we had to be very careful because we could barely talk about some of these issues, the proverbial third rail, especially when it comes to oil. These things are now on the table. They're fomenting an incredible trilateral dialogue. And so I just, let's pat all ourselves on the back for this, because I think we've come a long way, and I want to start with a little victory lap here at the beginning of this session. But we're moving to Mexico in this panel, and Duncan very kindly called the panel Mexico Panel. So I can do whatever I want on this.
Do whatever you like. You're the boss.
So we're not going to talk about the Selección Nacional. That's probably something we'll leave off the table for this panel. But what we want to do, I want to subtitle this, or I want to call this Mexico Panel, Taking Stock of Energy Reform. And I had some nice comments prepared about how far Mexico has come. 3 years almost since the constitutional amendment in December 2013. Just over 2 years since secondary legislation. But Deputy Secretary Hernandez got into a lot of the milestones that have been achieved. But I do want to hit on a couple others that weren't specifically mentioned. There have been 3 upstream bid rounds that have taken place. There have been a massive, major level of detail in terms of overhauling regulatory environment institutions. Duncan mentioned that you'll have here at the Wilson Center Carlos de Regules from ASEA. ASEA didn't exist 18 months ago. That's a brand new institution that's part of the upstream and the oil and gas side of Mexico's energy reform. So again, I want to emphasize the pace. I want to emphasize how much has been accomplished. The power auctions, there's been a successful auction. Today they're receiving final offers for the latest private power auction that SENACE and CFE are having underway. So we expect, as you noted, good results on that. There's several things that have happened. We can go down the list, and I know Guillermo is going to get into a lot of the regulatory details, so we'll save that for him. But I just want to end by a couple of final points and then some challenges that I want to get into in the panel. The state monopolies, the state behemoths of CFE and Pemex were obviously major pieces, and their overhaul and their changes were major pieces of this reform. And these are the things that perhaps have not moved as fast as some of the other pieces of the reform. We have seen now the appointment of some of the new unbundled segments of CFE, but Pemex remains sort of the elephant in the room. Oil is still a bit of an issue. So tremendous success, but also we have to focus on some of the challenges, the oil production issue, how Pemex manages its company in this new environment. Both of the state companies are managing a transition to a brand new energy horizon in Mexico. I think these are things that we have to keep our eye on. The pace of most of the reform has been blistering, and congratulations on so many of the milestones hit, but I think when it comes to CFE and Pemex particularly, we need to step back, and we'll get David Goldwyn's thoughts on that latter point here in just a minute. So let me introduce, I think, Guillermo Garcia Alcocer from the CRE. Congratulations on your confirmation as president of the CRE. Is going to begin our panel with a formal presentation, right, Guillermo?
That's right.
So do you want to go to the
Should I
podium?
take-
Yeah, I think, is there a, yep. Guillermo Garcia Alcocer, as I said, the president of the Comisión Reguladora de Energía, the regulatory agency, energy regulatory agency in Mexico.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Duncan, for the invitation, and thanks, David, for being here with us. Undersecretary Hernandez was very thorough on the explanation on the electricity market. I won't go through that. We are also colleagues in that market, but I think we should stress the part of hydrocarbons. But just for you to know, this is a very important slide, as Cesar mentioned. I will also start by the end. We have this investment being identified. It is put in place, some of the auctions in the hydrocarbons sector, the pipelines, and the power sector auctions. So if you see, this is massive. So if you were to take just one slide to your think tanks, to your academy, to your places of origin, this would be it. This is the reform in Mexico. This is very, very big. When I started working in the reform, we had a negotiation panel with the Congress, and the question was always, is this a energy policy thing? Well, it's something that the ministry has to do. Is it upstream? Well, the CNH, our sister agency, is the regulator. But everything else was sent to the CRE, to the National Regulatory Energy Commission. So we are in the chain of value. We are on non-processed products. We do the transportation regulation, and once it goes into the refining process, the ministry gives the permits, but then the CRE enters, and we go all the way into the retail. So this is a big challenge we have. On electricity, we had one important thing, that on the first year, all of the regulation was done by Mr. Hernandez, and we did all the presentations. Next year, Mr. Hernandez will do all the presentations, and we will do all the work. So it will be challenging next year. But we are also, in the long term, the regulator of this whole market, starting with the generation permitting, the transmission and distribution rates, and the retailing and commercialization regulation and also ruling. For you to understand, we are like FERC and all the local regulators for energy in one body. That's also like NEB and all the provincial and territorial regulators in Canada. So it is easy for us to move fast because we don't have a lot of authorities going through the same process. And this is something different from what you have in the US and Canada. I think that is good for you to know. This is our mandate. Our mandate is we need to ensure that the energy gets to the consumers in the right quantities with the appropriate specifications and at competitive costs. If we can do those three things, we have done our job. But those three things are very complicated to attain. This was the CRE prior to the reform. We had 15 regulatory obligations. We were a state-owned company regulator. We had a very dysfunctional relationship with Pemex. We loved them and we hate him, but that was all we did. That was all the regulatory body did. With the reform, as I said, most of the regulatory attributions were sent to the CRE. I have already read the 61 attributions. I know them, but we need to land them as well. So this is a very important challenge in hydrocarbons. I will talk about the auctions. As you know, we launched the 3 auctions. I come from this sector. I met David Goldwyn at the beginning of this process, and he was fundamental into us looking at the process and seeing the challenges. The first process was not a success. We sent all of the risks to industry and all of the benefits to the government. We were happy about it. But they weren't, and David was very kind on showing us that that was the case. But nevertheless, we adjusted the contract and we awarded 2 blocks in that first tender. In the second tender, we had a better result, and the third tender was also a complete success. We have now 27 companies doing exploration and production. We have many American and Canadian companies, and this is something that is going on. No? The fourth bid will be awarded. It's a deep water bid. This is the crown, of the jewel of the crown. And this will be awarded in this year, the December 5th. And we have 26 companies that have paid to participate in the process. These are the big companies. You can see the first tier of companies, worldwide companies in there. We have Exxon, we have Chevron, we have BP, we have Total, we have, just name it, and all of them are there. And we think that this will be a very good also auction. There's the Trion auction also running right now. There's 8 companies that are also registered. People are saying, well, there is less interest in Trion than what we are seeing in 1.4. But the thing is, 1.4 has 10 blocks, and Trion is 1 block. So I think that we need to compare things with justice. This will be awarded as well on December 5th. So this is a very nice setup in which you can have a Trion and have the areas that surround it, and somehow get a good project. You need economies of scale in these large projects. You need joint ventures with companies. So we're waiting for December 5. But at the same time, the Ministry of Energy and the CNH has launched the round 2.1, that is shallow waters again. In this case, they took, I was in charge of the design of this auction prior to my appointment as president of CRE. So sorry for the excitement, because I'm really happy about it. The thing is that we looked at auction 1.1, and we said, well, there was interest in some of these areas, but they didn't have the right size, they didn't have the right data. We understood that we are selling geology, we're selling information, we're not selling blocks in the sea. We need to give good information to companies. So there was a rearrangement of those blocks that had interest but were not awarded, bigger blocks and nicer information. So this will be awarded on March of next year. And it was also launched the 2.2 auction. It will be awarded on April 5. So things are going well. There is a mature system in Mexico in which we can have 4 auctions at the same time being administered by the CNH. So we are waiting for them. No? So now entering into my topic, that is natural gas as well as electricity. This is something that our national bank, this is the Bank of Mexico, the independent banking authority, they said that we had shortage of gas in 2012 and 2013, and it costed to our economy almost a fourth part of a percentage point of growth. 0.28 percentage points was the cost of not having gas in 2012 and 2013. So this is something that is not good for a company as ours, or as a country as ours, because we don't like to go like Venezuela to some sort of shortage of things. No, we need to have abundance of energy. So we have a plan to have an open market, competitive market next year. The first stage was to enhance natural gas availability. That was what Undersecretary Hernandez was talking about. We have a very big plan put in place. We have 78% of the infrastructure already working, already constructed. We separated pipeline from commercialization. Pemex its pipelines were taken from Pemex. It was a difficult process, but the thing is that we thought that we couldn't get Pemex to work with the same, the commercialization with the pipeline ownership. That was something different from the electricity reform as it was appointed. We established open access and pipeline capacity reserve conditions. We issued a symmetric regulation for Pemex so that he would give up areas of marketing, and we will publish a lot of volumes of prices and discounts so that the market starts working with information. So this is the map prior to what Mr. Hernandez presented. We call this the national system of pipelines. It was not national and it was not a system. But we really like to call it that way. And as this administration started, a lot of pipelines were constructed, and we have plans for the ones that are on red. So once you have that system of transport, you have then distribution. This is the way we look at distribution in Mexico. That's the way companies will get their gas. We have, for instance, in Hermosillo and Sonora, in Sinaloa, we have a lot of things going on in distribution due to the transport system that is being built. So that's the way gas goes to the cities. Now, this is the permits we are giving. I will go into gasoline just to take my time. This is something interesting. We gave in retail to gasoline stations their permits, and not one sheet of paper was used. All of it was electronic. When I came into office, I said, I want to go and see the archives. No, I want to see where the millions of pages of these permits are. And not one piece of paper was used in these 10,000, 11,000 permits that were given. There's a lot of technology in here, and we will be awarded a prize by the federal government by the end of this year because of this project. This is the gasoline system in which we will be having new infrastructure put in place. We need to have infrastructure. The Pemex infrastructure is at full capacity, and these 4 projects are working right now with our regulatory body. They have already asked for the permits, and they are running their open seasons. And for instance, this project is for taking gasoline from Corpus Christi to Monterrey. And these projects are important because these other projects, because they go to the center. This is the way the gasoline goes to Mexico, by the sea, from Houston to Tuxpan, and then to Mexico City. So these projects are running. There is these other projects of storage and train stations. For instance, this San Luis Potosí project was approved yesterday. We awarded it yesterday. This is something companies ask from us. We give the permit, and this is a train project in which they will get their gasoline from a refinery in Texas, and they will launch a massive train facility in San Luis Potosí, and then they will supply gasoline for the center. So things are moving for this market in which we have almost a third of the gasoline stations that you have in the US per habitants, no, for population. And then on the last stage of gasoline, we have this branding. In Mexico, we had no difference in brands. You had Pemex brand or Pemex brand. They were privately owned, but you could not distinguish one from the other because they were just the same. They were designed the same. And right now, these companies are doing their efforts to differentiate their products, their services, and we have already these nice gas stations put in place. They have supply from Pemex. But once these projects become a reality, they will start receiving gasoline from another alternative. And they are giving discounts. That is something that is strange for Mexico as well. Last year, we gave the possibility of having a maximum price, and companies, if they had some advantages in logistics or whatever, or they wanted to sacrifice part of the margin to get a broader consumption base, they were allowed to give discounts. So for instance, this gasoline station is in front of my office, and there's a line of cars going in there, and the owner is very happy. The car owners are also happy to stand in line and to get a nice discount. So things are moving, and they are moving more fast. Next year, the executive branch, President Peña Nieto, sent to Congress a change in the law so that we could open the gasoline sector in 2017. And this thing is pending approval, but we think that it will be approved in most of its terms. But the thing is that we will open gradually the market. What we think that we will be doing is that we will look at the whole country, and we will see where there are many gasoline stations and many gasoline station owners. And if that's the case, or if there is a project in process to have open access storage or conditions for competition, we will award the competitiveness area, and we will say, well, this is something that needs that won't have price caps. And in the areas in which these conditions could not be confirmed, we will have a price cap, no? We will have all of the gasoline stations to publicize their prices in big displays. There's a lot of measures in here, but the thing is that the good news is that we are trying to move faster than what the original reform said. This is the electricity sector. I will leave this presentation for you to have. I think that Undersecretary presentation was very interesting and good. And I will just tap in this topic. Sorry about that, but this is a puzzle, and this is how we think the market should be built, or what are the stages of the market to be built. And there was the law, the rates, the operational rules, the first and second auction, the creation of CFE's enterprises, the division, and right now we are setting the new pieces of the puzzle so that we can have the whole market. We are doing the assignment of legacy contract. This is the Ministry of Energy with our opinion. We are a little bit lagged on our opinion. We're working with Undersecretary, but we think that this will be solved in the next few weeks. Then once we have the legacy contracts, that's what will be paid for the old plants in CFE for the basic service. Then we can go to the Ministry of Energy and say, well, what is the subsidy policy that you will put in place, because this thing will cost different from what it cost in the prior model. And once we have those things, we will set the basic supply rates. That's adding distribution, transmission, and the legacy contracts to other services, and that way we can have the basic supply rates. Why is this important? Because this is the pricing that will be sent to the market for the companies to compete with CFE. This is what CFE will charge to all the people that stay with CFE, not changing to other suppliers. And that is an important price signal, because that way companies will go and find their supplier or stay with CFE if they are comfortable with the payment. This is something for you to keep. This is a very simple chart of what's going on in the market. We need qualified users. No, we have this letter. We send this letter to the users, to the potential users. These are the people that can participate in the market. You have to have more than 1 megawatt of consumption. And if you don't like the market, you can always go back in the next 5 years. No? This is something we are giving to the potential suppliers of qualified users. This is the zip code, and this is what is the demand of energy for each zip code. And this is the demand that is more than 3 megawatts. This is the green one. And this way, we are giving this information for free. We cannot say which companies are on each zip code, but if you go to the zip code and you see the big signs, you will knock the door and you will sell. You will have the possibility of giving your services. So the important thing about these markets is that there is not that much information for companies to understand where to go and find their consumers. So we are trying to give this information. We're giving this information in the ministry. This is something that under minister also mentioned, that we are converging in the industrial rate to the US rate. This is something very interesting because this is something that allows us to be very competitive internationally. I will leave the presentation and I'm ready for your questions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. There will certainly be a lot of questions, but let's wrap up the rest of the panel. And we're delighted to have David Goldwyn, who's currently the president of Goldwyn Global Strategies, a longtime public servant in the U.S. government. At the beginning of the Obama administration, was the special envoy for energy issues at the State Department, counselor to the Secretary on energy issues. David, I know you want to get into some of the things I alluded to in terms of oil and gas and Pemex and our eternal discussions over whether oil, whether Pemex.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Duncan, for having me here. And Guillermo, good to see you. Well, Guillermo keeps getting promoted at this rate. Who knows where he'll be next year. It's really fantastic. Taking stock, I think, is a good theme. And I think, as all of you have heard today, Mexico has really been best in class in terms of how you reform the energy sector, both in oil and gas and in electricity. I don't think there's a country that has moved as fast or as well. We haven't talked about transparency much today, but it is probably among the most, if not the most, transparent system, from publication of contracts to publication of revenues to only having regulators communicate with industry, sort of through e-communication. In fact, it's a little bit rigid, but it's really remarkable. And so the progress, I think, is indisputable. On the oil and gas side, though, I think we are really at an inflection point. The first bids have gone well. There has been a tremendous amount of learning, as Guillermo said, from the first one. And I think Mexico really has to be complimented because they have listened and adapted dozens of times, both the oil framework, the way they run the bid rounds, and they have seen success. And, very few governments have the confidence or the flexibility to do that. But I think right now, both for the deep water, but more so for Pemex's farm outs, Mexico faces some challenges, all within the control of the government, to address. But they are going to have to stay competitive, I think, on the rates, because people are canceling projects. $380 billion in cut projects. Prices remain relatively low, and countries like Brazil are starting to compete, by offering a different framework, offering people to farm in, and then there's the Gulf of Mexico. I think we haven't talked about security or sort of the sub rosa corruption issues that are in procurement down the line. At the local level, those are also challenges, I think, as well. And continuity. Mexico has succeeded because it has an amazing class of technocrats who have run this reform and worked really night and day in multiple jobs, multiple positions. Enrique Ochoa, Lourdes Melgar, who've gone on to other positions as well. I mean, it's really phenomenal, but you've got to keep that going. And then the elections are also an issue. But Pemex, as you mentioned, has really been the laggard in the reform. And I sympathize. It's big. It's a national symbol. It's got very strong unions. It's very hard to do, to make change there. But they have $96 billion in debt. They have more employees per gallon, per barrel, than probably any company in the world. They are in a lot of businesses that they probably shouldn't be in, from tugboats to other things where they could monetize their capital. And they're still about $22 billion a year short in the capital they need to invest in enhanced oil recovery and deep water and running their operations. And that's the reason for the reform on the oil side in the first place, is Pemex needed the capital and they needed the technology to move forward. So on the deep water round, I think that it looks good. The market is competitive. There have been some concerns about a level playing field, how intensely regulatory it is, but I think that'll be fine. But the farm outs, which is the acreage that Pemex got to keep, that it hoped to partner with other countries to develop, has not gone well. And this is really, I think, a prototype of what the challenge is for Pemex. The reform said you get your partner by auction. You don't get to pick them. This was out of the distrust, frankly, of the PON for the PRI and the PRD for both parties and people's distrust of, so this was the way that the deal was cut. But CEO Lozoya resisted that, and now he's not there. And enormous cuts needed to be made, and not enough were made. And now you have a situation where as much as everybody in the private industry wants to partner with Pemex as a hedge against the future, and because they have local knowledge, the reality is, I think, for these farm outs, is that they have, the Pemex has missed the boat for this administration. Farming out and developing these fields was supposed to be where Mexico would get 200 to 300,000 barrels a day of new production. Too late for that to happen in this sexenio. And the new contract, which really, I think, again, puts too much risk onto the private companies, doesn't have true international arbitration, is very one-sided. And I think Trion is an appetizing field, but I think it's the terms that are not there. And that's a case where I think the culture of trusting the private market, the culture of opening up and operating like a real company has not yet set in at Pemex. And my own worry, I would have to say, Guillermo, it's not your problem anymore because you've got the CRE, but I would say to our friends at SENER and at CNH, I would take a hard look at whether or not those formats and that contract is at international standards, because it is better for to have a delay than to have a failure. And I think they are not there. And that's a disappointment, but it's an example of where pushing Pemex and bringing them into the reform full speed is really going to be critical.
No, perfect, David. And absolutely, the farm outs, I think, for those of us who've been looking at this, we're so hopeful because of many of the reasons you outlined, the amount of capital, but also, like you said, we talked for decades about what did Pemex need? Access to capital, technology, best practices, and that was what farm outs partnerships were going to bring. And by the way, since the replacement of the head of Pemex, every other sentence includes the word partners or partnerships by the CEO of Pemex. So it's hard to square the circle because you don't see any forward progress on the farm outs. And to your point about the Trion or the Trion that's part of the auction, it seems like it was, I don't know, shoehorned, wedged into this deep water auction. So these are things come back to. But Duncan, I know you're on our panel, and we'd love to have your thoughts before we get into the conversation. You know what we haven't talked about? I don't know if I'm sure you're able. Paris Agreement. Mexico ratified the Paris Agreement. This happened this week as part of the UN General Assembly, so that's an important. The clean energy certificates, the renewable target, 25%, is it 2018, 25% clean energy? Mexico, why don't you take some of that on?
Sure, absolutely. Let me just sort of double back on a couple of things that David said before I do, very, very quickly, because I think it's worth emphasizing. You mentioned both the responsiveness of the government in this process, the bidding process, and also the quality and the hard-working nature of the team. And I said recently at a conference in Mexico, I said, I think we're coming to the point where we're going to look back at this period as kind of the golden age of energy decision-making in Mexico, because assembling such a team of experts, assembling such a team of people who are not only experienced, but have actually, a lot of them had been through this before under Calderon, unsuccessfully. And we all look back at that period as saying, well, that was a failed attempt. In fact, I think in retrospect, it was a great learning process. And I think that as we, and I'm not just saying this because, the two of you are my friends and we've known each other for a long time and because you're here.
But it gave us CNH, to your point. I mean, there is a definite, the reform under Calderon created CNH. So
exactly.
It's not black.
It's progressive. My big concern, though, like David, is that I hope that we are going to see similarly high-quality people coming into these positions of influence in the future, and that they will have the same attitude of responsiveness. And that attitude of responsiveness was not a natural thing at the beginning. Remember, there was kind of a bristling when the industry and analysts made comments. There was like, oh, we don't really like the fact we're supposed to be in charge. And then they gradually learned how important, how useful that process really was. And so I hope that this is not the best that we see, but I fear that things are not going to be as good in the future as they are now. Let me point to 4 factors on the sort of renewable energy, climate change front in Mexico that I think are very, very important. The first one is that, I was at a conference recently in Mexico City, and a bunch of investors were there talking about the renewable energy landscape. And they said over and over again, this is the place in the Americas, if not the world, to be for renewable energy investments at this point in time. And I said, well, that's a pretty strong statement. And they said, yeah, but you know what? If we look at where the other place to be was, which is the United States until recently, it really doesn't compete now against what's on offer here in Mexico. And I asked them to sort of lay out what those factors are that make it such an attractive place to invest. And the first one they said was, the resource. I mean, the resource for renewable energy investment in Mexico is extraordinary. We all know that about the quality of the wind and the solar and the geothermal resource. But it's highly concentrated, and there are opportunities to invest there. The second one is to do with demand growth. And the fact is that Mexico looks as though it's going to have a significant upward curve in demand in the years to come. And of course, the government itself has committed to basically providing 1 out of every 2 electrons in the future, that sort of added capacity from renewable sources. That's an extraordinary opportunity right there. The third one, and I think this was perhaps the most important one that investors were pointing to, was they said that the regulatory framework, the regulatory agencies on the renewables and electricity side, and the overall investment climate in Mexico are really unmatched anywhere else right now in the Americas. And that, I mean, again, that's a very, very big statement to make, but they pointed to the fact that both CENER is sort of doing the right things and creating the market, but also that the regulatory agency, the CRE, is doing its part. And lastly, and I think this is perhaps the most important, it touches directly on what you said about Paris, is that the climate change strategy in Mexico and the energy reform go very nicely hand in hand. And I remember back in 2012 when there was the change of government, and it seemed as though all the focus was going to be on oil and gas. And it seemed as though, well, is this new government, going to keep the commitment that was there under Calderon to an international and national climate change strategy that was as aggressive? And the fact is, this is now a trans-sexennial strategy. It's what was begun under Calderon is continued under Peña Nieto, and it's now sort of deeply embedded in government policy. That provides a certain degree of certainty and predictability for investors. They see that this is something which the Mexican government is committed to. And everything that happened in Paris, and everything that happened, of course, with the announcement in Ottawa this year, bringing in line the 3 countries that we alluded to in an earlier panel, that really, really, really does help to get people excited. Now, I'm not saying that this process is perfect, and of course, I had a conversation the other day with a company that builds solar plants in Mexico, is looking to build solar plants in Mexico. It's a big American company. And they have been trying to get contracts from those people who won some of the bids in the January auction. And they said the problem is the prices that they won with are so low that they cannot afford to pay us what we need to be paid to build those solar farms. And so maybe we went too far. Maybe we were too successful in January, and this is part of the sort of the settling out that we're going to have to see in the weeks and months ahead.
No, perfect. Indeed. I mean, I think, in the auction and the price of the historic price, but also there was a lot of, folks who were wondering, because there was some extremely ambitious commitments, not just on price, but timeline in terms of when projects are going to come online. And some of these projects, as you alluded to, were in the very early developmental stages. And you hit on something there that I wanted to lay out for the entire panel, and maybe I'll then go to Guillermo with a specific question. community engagement issues and stakeholder engagement, the social license to operate, as we like to call it in the we call it everywhere, the social license to operate. And it's an issue that cuts across every segment of the energy sector. It's not an upstream only, it's not a midstream. It is an issue for the entire energy sector. And it's a brand new issue in Mexico in the sense of you now have an opened market with a lot more players, and you've gotten away from these two behemoths I mentioned earlier that basically could come in and said, well, our role in stakeholder engagement and community affairs is we're doing the project, and here is your compensation, if any. So let's take that. But Guillermo, so think about that, all the panel, and how that impacts whether it's renewables, whether it's upstream. But let me ask you a specific question, Guillermo, because the four principal objectives that the Deputy Secretary laid out in terms of alignment with the will of the Mexican people for the energy reform, and you talked about the gasoline station across the street that's very happy. Is the reform being perceived as a success in the Mexican population, in the Mexican public?
Can I think on that? We think that.
I mean, in terms of the economic development opportunity, the objectives that Cesar laid out.
As Under Minister mentioned, we have been very successful in having the rates going down. And I think that's something that people are happy about. We are also being successful with the LPG gas going down as well. There was an important announcement a few weeks ago because the international price is very low, as you know, but prices weren't going low.
Right.
So we, as government, made the decision of setting a new maximum price and a lot of measures to promote competition. I didn't talk about it because I would need a whole hour for that topic just to talk about it. But the thing is that people like to pay less for their energy. That's what what was said. But we need to make an effort so that the reform is perceived in more jobs and in more development in the areas. That transmission line that is going to be built in Oaxaca, from Oaxaca to the center, is very important because that way we can have a larger set of windmills producing electricity in the south, and that's the region in which we have less development in Mexico. No. We need to set these special economic regions with these energy conditions, and that way people will see things better. We need to work a lot on that, Martin. But let me...
There's clearly benefits, though, in terms of, you both laid out the immense growth in pipelines, the immense growth, and so there has to be ways to convey those benefits, whether it's direct economics. But anyway, please, go ahead.
But the thing is, we have seen petrochemical plants that were built at the end of started at the end of the Calderon administration, but were put in place, for instance, the Tileno 21 plant that hired around 8,000 people, and it had a very close relationship with the community in there. And there has been some examples of bad experiences with communities, but there is also the rest of the projects have no problem. For instance, this huge pipeline that was built, the Ramones pipeline, there was not one social issue in 2,000 kilometers pipeline. There was a lot of talking with the communities. There was a lot of work. And let me tell you just something that was interesting. And Lourdes Melgar was this friend of ours and my former boss. Yeah. We were at the table discussing the reform, and the electricity reform had a special chapter on social issues. And I was on the other side with Mr. Ochoa, and we at the time thought that it was not something that we needed in our sector. Fortunately, Lourdes went into our office and said, well, we need this chapter as well. And the thing is that I am very grateful to her because this is a big issue, and this is the first law in Mexico that incorporates the social issue in a very orderly manner in which things are working out. Things are starting to work. There's a small office in the Ministry of Energy. We work with them, and the pipelines are being constructed. The lines are in place, and I think that we need to learn from good experiences worldwide, and even in the bad experiences, we're winning the legal fight. No, We at CRE are in charge, as well as the Ministry of the Defense of the Eolic plant in the south. And we won an important stage a few weeks ago. It's 2 weeks ago. And I think that we need to teach also the judges that things are being fair for the community. No? There's a lot of learning in there.
No, and in building trust, I think, is sort of a summary of that, and I think that's an excellent point. David, that point, we have a lot to talk about on whether it's farm outs or, I want to get back to something you said, because did I detect correctly that you think it's time perhaps to consider pulling Trion off of this December 5th auction?
Yes. But let me address just quickly the first 2 points. What's so remarkably courageous about this reform is that a lot of the benefits are long-term.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the ironies is that, the electricity reform, I think from an external point of view, has been enormously successful. It has reduced industrial prices.
Right.
And I would measure it by foreign investment, by who wants to build, Ford wanting to build a new manufacturing plant, because they're seeing that prices will be competitive and the investment framework is attractive. Residential consumers are still being subsidized.
Yeah.
So they're not seeing the difference.
Yeah.
And then assuming that the price liberalization for gasoline and diesel takes place, to some extent prices will go up and then they'll probably come down. So it's hard, I think, for the consumer to see it directly other than the growth of the economy. So I think that's a challenge. On stakeholder engagement, I think, at least in the unconventionals, the big challenges are still to come. I had the chance to, when ASEA first got started, to talk about some of these issues. And the system for unconventionals is you get your license for the subsurface, you negotiate with the ejido for surface access. There's a little bit of money in there for the ejido for royalties if they choose to participate. And then there's an arbitration mechanism where another ministry will come in and resolve disputes. So you really need a stakeholder strategy which will start to educate people about where will development take place, what will they experience, what will surface disruption be like, water issues, because the water ministry is involved also, how will farmers interact. From my perspective, one of the reasons we've seen the unconventional rounds delayed is that stakeholder engagement process is really at the very early stages. And I think that will need to take place going forward. So to some extent in the upstream, there hasn't been a lot of exploration yet, so that's still
And some of the contracts are offshore to date, so you have maybe less of a friction.
Land-based. But some of the areas came out of the early even thinking about unconventional rounds because of concerns about security, but I think it's stakeholder engagement. On the farm outs, I guess from my point of view, I really want the farm outs to go well, because the success of the reform will largely be judged by whether Mexico can reverse declines, produce more, generate revenues. And to some extent, the near-term opportunity is all in the farm outs. And I have sympathy for Pemex in that it is really rigid. No other company in the world has ever had to pick their enhanced oil recovery partner through an auction, because usually it's a conversation. And so what's the field like? Do we have that technology? How are we going to do it? So it's a very inflexible system, but it's the system. And so, there's in the future, maybe it would get adapted in a different way. And so it needs to really go well in order to get production up and in order to create those kinds of joint ventures where Pemex will learn now about efficiency in the system, because they've done nothing on efficiency, and they can really learn a lot and save a lot of money. But the contract, the joint operating agreement, has to be at a world level standard. Otherwise, nobody is going to want to take the risk of having a large partner who has a lot of control and maybe big cultural differences, where you have all the risk and they get the reward. They just won't do it. And so I'm afraid it will fail. And September 30th is the deadline for the new joint operating agreement, and it's like a marked up old service agreement. So, by my lights, I say this with love, I say this as a friend, I would scrap it, I would redo it, I would delay it, and then I would get it done right. Maybe it would just be another 2 months, maybe it would be another 3 months. But my fear is that if it doesn't change significantly, there'll be very little interest, and the government doesn't need that disappointment. Better to get it right and do it a little bit late. And I think the government has that control. It's not, maybe a little bit wholesale. If you used an international model, it might be better. But pick Norway, pick another country, but start from that model not from the old Pemex model. And I think it can be done pretty quickly, but I think it's really important to do to succeed. And if you get that right, then I think the near-term gains for the government and the political gains, and I'd like to hear what Duncan thinks about continuity in the future here on the politics, but showing some real success and interest and getting some real help to Pemex, I think will help the survivability of the reforms in the next election if it turns out, not to be the pre or the pon. So those two parties are all largely synchronized, but not every party is. So I think it's important.
Well, in continuity is the perfect word, and that is exactly the point of the question: how is this being perceived in the Mexican public? Because we're moving very quickly in Mexico into the next electoral cycle, and these are interconnected: results, success, and what that means for continuity. So, Duncan, over to you, and then I know we have to wrap up. So,
yeah, no, just very, very quickly. You asked the question: is the reform popular? It's not popular, but then none of the reforms are popular in Mexico. The fact is the government is very unpopular in Mexico. The president is very unpopular in Mexico right now. The fact is that anything associated with the government is looked at with a kind of a sneer by a majority of the population. And that's a real problem. There are tangible benefits there, but I don't think those tangible benefits have filtered their way down to the average man and woman in the street. The promises that were made on energy prices, for the citizen, that they wouldn't go up, well, those are silly promises to make because you can't really commit to those. And of course, there has had to be adjustments in prices. I think that it's going to be a long-term thing. I think history will be very, very kind to the reform. But I don't see that the public opinion is going to turn around on this in the short term. And that feeds directly, as both of you intimated, into the next election. It is a very useful political tool for the Mexican left right now to say, look at what they did to the energy system. They can point to Pemex and they can say, look, Pemex is much, much weaker than it was before. The reason why I'm a fan of the farm outs, and I think that they need to be done right, is because we need to have a stronger Pemex at the end of this process than we had at the beginning. And that has not happened, and it's not likely to happen. And so I'm often asked the question, well, let's suppose that a left-wing, a Morena government came in Mexico. They couldn't undo the energy reform, could they? And the point is that no, they can't. They can't change the constitution without their two-thirds majority, both chambers, and the majority of the state legislatures, etc. But what they can do is they can throw sand into the gears. You can slow it down. You can simply say, we're not having any more bidding rounds. You can say, we're not going to offer any more auctions. You can say, we're going to change the fiscal framework. You can say that we're going to move out the progressive people in the regulatory agencies and put in people who want to make life much more difficult. We can create an investment climate here that people are not interested in. It's very easy to see how that could happen. I doubt that the Morena as a party or the party leadership actually wants to do that. I think they will use the rhetoric of that, but if they were to win power, I think they'd be a lot more reasonable. There's a lot of reasons why I think we can assume that, or rather we would speculate about that, which we don't have time to go into here. Yeah. But it's a question that's up in the air right now.
But I think that's the whole reason that there was a constitutional amendment, because sand in the gears is one thing. Reversion of the entire reform is a different opportunity cost, or whatever you want to call it. So I know Guillermo has a comment he wants to add, but let me ask a question, one sort of a one-answer question for all of you, and Guillermo, you can answer the question and then add your comment. Taking stock of energy reform, what's the number one biggest success, or what's the milestone that you think is the key milestone at year 3 in terms of energy reform?
At year 3?
Yeah, well, 3 years since the at this point, let's say.
Well, I would say for me it's, as I said, to have in the energy the country needs at the right price. If you see the automotive industry, how is it growing? It is growing in the areas in which we have natural gas. Yep. It is not aleatory, no? Mm-hmm. The allocation of this industry. And it is basing its operations in the center of Mexico, and that's the area in which most of the new gas that is going to be imported from Mexico is coming. So, if we can have these large volumes of energy coming into Mexico or produced in Mexico as energy, as electricity, I think that would be the competitiveness that we can bring into the formula. No, the growth was said in the prior panel. No, national growth, and we think that we have a very important thing in having energy available at a reasonable or competitive cost.
Perfect.
That would be my comment. But on the continuity, as Duncan said, the Constitution has a very large set of transitory dispositions that are not transitory. They are said to be transitory, but they are permanent dispositions. And you would need 2/3 of our Congress to change that.
Right.
Plus, half
The State
plus
House.
one of the states. No election in Mexico has that characteristic.
Mhm.
Mexicans are very conservative. We like to have a differentiated vote. People vote for one people for the presidency, another one for the Congress. And there's these checks and balances that are naturally formed in our system. So I think that changing the Constitution is something that we won't see.
Yep.
And the other thing that I would like to comment is that the regulatory bodies are appointed by Congress. So for a new administration to change,
Which was part of the reform.
that's part of the reform. You need 2/3
Mhm.
of the Senate to appoint a chairman.
Correct.
And our appointments are staggered, as you say,
Correct.
and that way you will always have continuity in the regulator, no? And we are the feet of the reform in some way, no?
Let's hope.
Thank you.
No, and congratulations. Before, I mean, I don't want to jump in, but this point has been made. But let me emphasize it as well. For me, the most important thing, the pace has been amazing, and that is a testament to these gentlemen as well as everyone else in Mexico. David,
Okay, if I can pick a milestone for each sector. So for the upstream, I think it's fixing the farm outs and completing the deep water round. I think on gas and power, the build out of the transmission system and the gas pipeline system will lead to increased foreign investment in generation, which we haven't seen yet. And I think that will lead to a big boom in that investment. And in the midstream and downstream, I would say it's completing the price liberalization and not imposing an import tax on products and fuels. I think if you want people to build refineries, you want them to build storage, you want them to build more pipelines, you've got to have a market system that incentivizes that. And that's all on deck. So completing that would be my third.
excellent. Duncan, final thoughts?
Yeah, because we do need to take a break, I know, before the for the next panel. But let me just say that I think the fact that we're talking here at this level of detail about the Mexican energy reform sort of 3 years in is extraordinary. We used to talk about the fact that we needed reform.
Right.
We then used to talk about the fact, well, what kind of reform? Now we're actually talking about very fine grain issues. That in and of itself is a sign that we've done a great job.
Thank you very much. Guillermo Garcia Alcocer, David Goldwyn, and Duncan Wood. So we'll take a break.
Yeah, a quick 5 to 10 minute break. Snacks are available outside, and then please come back in for our panel on Canada's energy sector. Thanks very much.
Yeah,